Hello everyone. Welcome to this session. My name's Hailey and I'm an instructor with Veritas Prep, and I'm excited to be partnering with GMAT Club to chat with you guys just a little bit about pacing and a few additional big picture tips for success on the GMAT. Now, before we get started, any of you who might happen to be brand new to the channel or have not yet subscribed, please feel free to click that subscribe button. There are updates, videos like this one almost every day, and as a bonus, you'll be able to access GMAT Club's set of 7 practice tests for absolutely free. Yeah, so 7-day access to our practice sets or practice tests. So by all means, feel free to jump in. The link is in the description for you all. Looking forward to chatting with you guys. As we move through the live lesson today, feel free to ask questions in the chat so that we can make sure that what I'm going to cover on screen will align with your needs and your questions concerning pacing, mental preparation, and the final steps you might be taking in preparing for the GMAT. Now, along the way, there are a couple of things I have on the docket just so you guys know what to expect to cover in today's session. We are going to talk quite a bit about pacing and how to ensure that basically you are maximizing the value of your time across the section, right? That you are applying as much of your time as possible on high value add questions and closing any final gaps outside of your understanding of the content to prepare for the test. So if you guys have joined me for past sessions, you'll notice that this one's going to be a little bit different. We won't be formally covering content, so to speak, and there are many videos out there on this channel, on the Veritas channel, elsewhere, that you guys can access around content-driven learning takeaways. By all means, feel free to put your suggestions in the chat and we'll keep that in mind for future videos. But today we're going to be talking a little more about the big picture, talking a little bit about how to make sure you're investing your time wisely across the section. And of course, as we move through, please feel free to let us know how you're enjoying the session with those thumbs up, thumbs down buttons below the screen. So with that in mind, when we talk through today's points, the target that I'm looking to tackle, and again, this could be you 10 days into your prep, as a couple of you guys mentioned, or where you've invested several months and are trying to close final gaps. For many students who get the content, who would feel comfortable finding the hypotenuse of a right triangle if they were asked to find the hypotenuse of a right triangle, but who struggle on the GMAT because they don't pace as ideally as they could, because they invest time in processes that are excessively time consuming or that don't add as much value, and because in some cases they might just flat out not finish a section or rush too quickly through questions that were realistically in their wheelhouse. We want to make sure we recognize that one of the very key elements to success on the GMAT is pacing. It's how you apply your time across the section. Because we're looking at a computer adaptive test that doesn't allow us to flag questions and return back to them later, we want to make sure we are investing our time as wisely as possible. And in fact, I see this time and time again. Students who perform really well on questions in untimed capacities, when they're going through questions with low pressure, where they can take as much time as they need to peruse through the question, but when they hit that test environment, they find that their accuracy tends to really dwindle, that it tends to decline. And oftentimes, this comes down to a couple of big picture key strategies we can start to apply. And in fact, I had a student just this past week who was able to raise her score from a plateau of between 610 and 630 up to a 780 in 2 weeks just by virtue of applying her time more efficiently. So we want to look for opportunities here to work smarter, not harder, to front load our time on the analysis, and to invest our time as wisely as we can across the section. So with that in mind, as I mentioned, your goal on the GMAT is to maximize the impact or the value of your time spent. Basically, spend as much time as you can on high value add questions and on processes that allow you to up the probability that you guess effectively. Now, there's this huge kind of misnomer around that you need to be an absolute expert at everything there is to know about the English language, or an absolute expert at everything there is to know about the field of mathematics to be successful on the GMAT, and that just isn't the case. Once you've built the foundations, a very large portion of your success will come from recognizing that time is a valuable asset and you want to use it wisely. So we want to make sure we're taking a step back and not necessarily pursuing excessively calculative paths for which we don't necessarily see the path to the answer. We want to make sure that if we need to move forward from a question because we've identified it as a low value add question at, say, the 20 or 30 second mark, we recognize that maybe investing an additional 10 or 15 seconds will up the probability that I guess the question correct if I can narrow things down from, say, 5 options to 2 or 3. So it's about investing your time where it's going to add value. And when we speak to effective pacing on the GMAT, that effective pacing is going to come from 2 major categories. On the big picture, it is benchmarking. And again, I'm going to give you guys my 2 cents around what I've found has been effective for students. Feel free to take from it what you feel applies to you as a learner, to you as a student, and give it a try. So benchmarking, you've probably heard before. It's basically checking in at specific question number intervals to see your time position. Now, you'll notice that what I've put on the board, and again, feel free to adjust this. If you know you have the confidence that you know what roughly 2 minutes feels like, and you don't need to check in every 5 questions, that's fine. Adjust accordingly. But you'll notice that when I set this up on screen, right, I'm having us check in at question number intervals, not at time intervals. And the reason for that is because when we check in at question number intervals, it allows us to more or less ignore the clock in the meantime. Because on test day and in practice tests, the more time you spend watching the clock tick down and looking at precisely how much time you've spent on each and every question at hand, the less time you're spending actively focusing on the questions themselves. So we want to make sure that we're able to put ourselves in a position to where after question 5, I take a look at the clock. If I have 62 minutes for quant and I should be spending about 2 minutes on average per question, after question 5, I can take a look at the clock. I should be at roughly 52 minutes. After question 10, at roughly 42 minutes. And so on at each 5 question interval throughout the test. Now, what that does is it allows us to get enough of a sense of our time position that we can see whether we're around where we should be on time, well ahead, or well behind. And we can use that to inform our question-to-question approach. Again, how we go about pacing, how we go about benchmarking our time position doesn't add a ton of value if we don't use that to adjust the way that we go about looking at things on a question-to-question basis. Because on a question-to-question basis, we should really never be in a position, right, to where we're saying, all right, well, I've hit precisely 2 minutes on this question, so no matter where I am, I need to move on. Or I've hit precisely 2 minutes and 30 seconds on this question, so no matter where I am, I need to move on. Instead, what we want to make sure we're doing is we want to front load the time on the analysis so that we're really focusing our time and effort on that first 20 or 30 seconds, roughly speaking, that we spend breaking down the question and thinking about what the question's really asking us in its simplest terms, what the path to the answer looks like, and ideally being able to identify that path before we start to really heavily put pen to paper, particularly on the quantitative section. Because if we can do that, it puts us in one of a couple really powerful positions. Either we can say, all right, I see what the path to the answer looks like. I'm confident I can get there. I know this is a process the GMAT could realistically be tasking me to apply, and I'm going to work through that question, even if it takes me a little over that 2-minute mark. Versus, all right, well, I think I see what the path to the answer looks like, but it seems intensely calculative, just outside of the scope of the GMAT. Because even on high-level questions, the GMAT is not meant to be all that calculative of a test. So if you find that you're setting up many steps of brute force long multiplication and long division and calculative steps, there's a really good chance you might be missing something along the way. And you may want to take a step back, broaden your approach, and look to see, okay, are there alternate strategies that I can apply? Is there anything across this question that I've missed? Have I missed a parameter? Have I missed what the question was tasking me to do? And it also puts you in the really valuable position to say, all right, I've invested a little bit of time, I've read through and tried to analyze this question stem, I still don't see what the path to the answer looks like, right? And at that point, when you've invested maybe 20 or 30 seconds, we don't want to sit and roll through a bunch of guesswork to attempt to get toward the answer. We want to recognize this as low value add time, and we want to seek out potential value add strategies that don't take a bunch of time out of our process. So could I back solve? Could I pick numbers? Could I take an alternate strategy? Are there obvious wrong answers that I can eliminate just based off the framework of the question, right? I cannot stress this enough. We should really never be in a position on the GMAT where we go, all right, I feel lost in this question and C is my go-to guess answer, so I'm gonna click C and move on, right? Those of you guys who have been in your prep for a while now have probably seen wrong answers are developed to attack very specific calculative mistakes or conceptual mistakes students will make. And so there are some answer choices that just flat out don't make sense if we take just a moment to think through why. So if I can spend just another 10 or 15 seconds running through my answer choices and breaking down, all right, is there something about the odd-even nature of the numbers? Is there something about the scale or the type of data I'm being asked to provide that allows me to eliminate obviously wrong answers and up the probability that I guess the question correctly? Because that on its own can sway your score not insubstantially. So we want to make sure we're using and leveraging everything we have to our advantage, and one of those very powerful tools is the answer options themselves. So we want to make sure we're using those to our advantage, and that along the way we recognize that time is not saved by rushing through the analysis. Whether it's the quantitative section or the verbal section, time is not saved by going too quickly to try to just crunch the numbers or too quickly to just try to eliminate answers. When we front load the time on the analysis, it allows us to move more efficiently through the question as a whole and thus through the section. So we want to take the time to make sure we're identifying the most efficient path to the answer. And we want to ensure we don't overlook the potential that if we can get our guess rate on questions that we've identified as low value add, whether it's quant or verbal, up to 50%, right? Up to 1 out of 3, rather than it being in a position to where we're 1 out of 5, well, that has a really powerful potential impact as well. So if we're keeping that in mind, I actually want us to take a look at a couple of examples of precisely what I mean. Now, if you guys have joined me for other classes, you'll see you generally give you guys some time to take a look at questions on your own. We go through a poll function, and then we regroup to talk through things together. Today, I just want us to have a little bit of a conversation around if I were to use a question that I'd identified as a low potential value add question and seek out how to up the probability that I guess the question correctly, how might I do so? Now, the 2 example questions I'm going to bring up for you guys are actually questions that I've done in previous webinars. So if you're curious the actual path to the answer, if you want to know how the math is done, I'm going to go ahead when the video's over, when the live stream is ended, I'm going to put the timestamps and the videos into the actual full-fledged explanations into the comments. So take a look there. Feel free to work through the questions fully on your own time because they're really great questions. But for the time being, what I want us to do is I want us to talk a little bit about how we might up our potential guess percentage just by recognizing and eliminating obviously incorrect structures. So the 2 questions I brought up here are question types that very notoriously students will get baited into investing a bunch of time into without necessarily seeing what that path to the answer is. They'll just work through stuff and they'll guesswork their way through a bunch of things and they'll see where to go from there, but ultimately they may not find that that strategy pays off for them. And even if it did, they may not find that they're in a position to where that time was very well invested. Even if you crunch through the numbers and you spend the 3, 4, 5 minutes on a question and you get to the correct answer, statistically speaking, you don't. But even if you did, if that is instead of an entire set of 2, 3, 4 questions that you're no longer able to tackle at the end of the section, that may not have been the best investment of your time. So let's hypothetically, and some of you guys might be perfectly comfortable with this question, maybe you've even seen this question before, but let's say hypothetically, we're in a position to where we've identified this as a low value add process, right? And yeah, so Ayusha's got us on the actual approach to the answer. That's awesome. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, we've identified this as a low value add. Maybe we looked at it for a solid 20 seconds. We broke it down. We saw if we could leverage information to our advantage, and we did not see the path to the answer. Is there anything about the structure of our answer choices that might allow us to eliminate obviously wrong answers? Even without any frame of reference or any hinting from those of you guys who do know the approach here in the chat. How might we move through this? Again, if this question feels comfortable for you, on test day, if you see a question like it, tackle it. But I want us to talk about what that process of eliminating obviously incorrect answers to up our guess percentage might look like. So what about our answer choices could we use to our advantage here? Someone talk to me a little bit about this one. Now, Ayush may have taken the next step and said, oh, well, I've got a square root of 3 in my first term, and I've got a pi in my second term, so I know that I'm looking at some version of either an equilateral or a 30, 60, 90 triangle minus some portion of a circle, and that is the path that's going to take us toward the answer, but LacTutor's got it. So what I'm looking for here is I'm saying, all right, well, wait a second. This is asking me for the area of a shaded region, and the area of a shaded region will never be negative. Right? And even without making the precise calculations, if I know that the square root of 3 is something that's going to be less than 2, and I know that pi is something that's a little more than 3, answer choice A provides us with a negative value, so it could not feasibly be the answer for any question that asks us for the area of a figure. Does anything else commit that same mistake? Do we have any other answer choices here that make that precise same mistake? Again, without doing the hard math, just seeing that square root of 3 is something less than 2 and pi is something greater than 3. Minus 36 times something that is greater than 3 could not feasibly be a positive number. I don't care what negative number this is, it's negative. So now we're in a position here to where we've upped our guess rate to 50% by investing essentially, now we took a little longer running through that process together, but if you were walking through that process on your own, I mean, that's an extra 10 seconds invested in this question that took us up from 1 out of 5 to 1 out of 2. And maybe we could even use a little bit of estimation, a little bit of reasoning from here to recognize the correct answer between the two. Now again, if you saw the path to the answer and you'd like to double check what the process looks like, I'll go ahead and link the video to where we fully absorb kind of very different learning takeaways from this question. It's in an earlier webinar series that I did, but for the time being, again, I want us to look for the potential to where even questions, whether it's on the quantitative or the verbal front, even questions that seem intimidating right off the bat, can be whittled down into a high percentage guess rate, and potentially that allows us to save time for higher value add questions. Because again, the whole objective to pacing is not to be stubborn and say, I absolutely have to get every single question right, or this is the second question, so there's no way I'm moving past this one until I find the answer. It's to maximize the value of your time across the section. So, for keeping that in mind, and D was our correct answer here for those of you guys who did do the math and are wondering. Again, I'll toss the explanation in for the sake of time today. I'm going to move us forward past it, but again, you'll be able to take a look at that at the close of the video. So I've got one more here for us, and I want to look at things in the context of data sufficiency. And this may be a strategy you're already comfortable with, but let's say, hypothetically speaking, that we did not see what the path to the answer looked like, how to leverage and use the geometric information that we've been given here, asking us what is the measure of angle AED minus the measure of angle ABE. Let's just take a brief moment to look at our statements. Is there anything that seems interesting about the interaction between these statements that may be worth noting if you were going to invest just a quick 15 or 20 seconds into upping the guess rate that you take into a data sufficiency question like this one? Well, statement 1 tells me the measure of angle BAE is 30 degrees. Statement 2 tells me the sum of the measures of angles ABE and AEB, so ABE, AEB, is 150. Is there anything that seems interesting about the information we've been given in statement 1 as compared to the information we've been given in statement 2? I know it's a pretty open-ended question, but I want to see where you guys take it. Anyone have thoughts for me here? So measure of angle BAE is 30. And then the measure of the other two angles creating that triangle with interior angles summing to 180 degrees is 150. That's exactly right, guys. So it gives us the same information. Now, if statement 2 and statement 1 give us the same information, even if we had no frame of reference for how to move through this question. Now, hopefully you do. It's a pretty cool question. I think it's worth the time invested. But even if you had no frame of reference, what are the only possible answer choices we can have when each of these statements provide us with the same information? Again, they've written it in different ways, but they've given us precisely the same info. So it could be E. Yeah, even when we put it together, not enough information. What else could it be? Could be D, good. The only feasible answer is anytime two statements provide us with precisely the same information is that each statement on its own is sufficient or each statement on its own is insufficient. Now, there could never potentially even possibly be any value add to combining those statements if they provide us with the same information. There could never be a situation in which one would be sufficient but the other would not if they give us precisely the same information. So already we've upped our guess rate to 50%. And here's where I will say, students run themselves into a lot of trouble using kind of statistics driven, when I see this, it's usually this, or when I see this, it's never that, to draw conclusions. But guessing strategies are where our statistics driven info could come into play. You might look at a question like this one and say, all right, I know it's got to be either D or E. And between the two, on geometry data sufficiency questions, it's way more likely that there was some relationship that I could have leveraged and I just didn't see, than that there wasn't anything I could do with the information and they just gave me a bunch of useless stuff, right? Answer choice E, generally speaking, needs to be proven, right? We need to prove that we don't have enough information to get there. We need to prove multiple possibilities or prove a yes answer and a no answer. So if I'm looking at this and I'm guessing, right, I'm taking a strategic punt between D and E, statistics do tell us that on data sufficiency geometry questions, we want to guess toward more sufficiency, not less, if we're in a position to where we just didn't see what that path looked like. Now again, I have a webinar explanation that goes full-fledged into the math behind this question. It's a pretty cool question. I suggest you guys check it out after today's session. But for the time being, again, I can't stress enough that just the difference between moving past questions that you inherently feel a little uncomfortable with by saying, I'm just gonna click C and move on, versus investing the additional few moments to up that guess percentage can make an enormous difference. Now, I know a lot of you guys at the start of the session were asking questions in this regard, more specifically concerning verbal. So let's talk about that a little bit. So in the context of verbal, there are a couple of things we want to keep in mind to ensure that we are maximizing the value of our time. Somebody asked about reading comprehension, and my apologies, I don't remember, it's off screen at this point. I don't remember who it was, so feel free to identify yourself if you'd like. But in the context of reading comprehension, we won't look at a formal example today, but we want to ensure that we're reading at the right level, that we're reading to understand why information is there, rather than reading to dig into each and every detail we see along the way. And that's sometimes a challenging thing to overcome because when we read on a day-to-day basis, we read to pick up and store details. Because the details on a day-to-day basis are what are going to be useful to us. Whether it's a text message or a textbook, a blog post or an email, whatever it is we're looking at, we pick up and store the details because the details are what we make use of. And in the context of the GMAT, it's not particularly helpful to try to read to pick up and store details because the details are there. It's an open book test in that regard. We can refer back on detail-driven questions as long as we know where to look for those details. And instead, we want to focus our read-through on looking to the bigger picture. Because if I can get to the close of each paragraph and understand why that paragraph is there, why the author constructed that paragraph, I can build that into why the passage as a whole is there, and that allows me to really efficiently answer bigger picture questions. Things like primary purpose, main idea, author would agree or disagree questions. And it saves me the time to be able to invest in seeking back on detail-driven questions and inferences. So a lot of this comes down to training yourself to read in the right way, to read GMAT style, regardless of whether English is your first language or not, because oftentimes if you commit a lot of time to outside reading beyond the GMAT, but you're not focused on that reading being GMAT style reading, you may run yourself into some bad habits. So just ensure along the way, whether you're looking to read specifically GMAT passages with corresponding questions, or whether you're looking to build on your English speaking skills, build on your vocabulary, although again, I can't stress enough, the GMAT is not meant to be a vocabulary driven test. If you don't know the meaning to a word, there's a really good chance you don't need to be successful. And you're able to read for the why rather than reading for the what. Now, where students generally find they run into the most trouble with pacing on verbal, the most consistent issue I see students run into is that they'll narrow down to 2 or 3 answer choices really quickly, and then they'll spend a bunch of time, they'll dump a bunch of time deliberating back and forth between those lingering 2 or 3 answer options. And if you know that that resonates with you, feel free to let me know in the chat. But the point that I want to make there is that that additional time invested going back and forth, trying to make a case between 2 answer choices that you feel have some merit, it tends to be low value add time. So how we tackle that is using effective and consistent structures, processes along the way, making sure that we're going into attack mode and we're looking to understand when I've narrowed down to 2 options, I'm not trying to make a case for what I like out of each of those 2 options. I'm finding something that is definitively wrong with one of those 2 options and selecting the other one. Process of elimination is absolutely your friend on GMAT verbal questions, and you want to make sure you leverage that to your advantage. So again, looking to find something wrong with all but one answer and utilize that process of elimination can be immensely helpful. And the other thing I hear all the time is students who will say, well, I'm consistently narrowing down to 2 answers and then I'm choosing the wrong one, so I must be most of the way there. And there's an extent to which there's a lot of merit to consistently narrowing down and having the correct answer be one of those final 2. But keep in mind that in many cases, all answer choices are not created equal on the GMAT. They might not necessarily, and if you've gone into the statistics in GMAT Club at all, you'll see that you won't necessarily expect that each wrong answer carries the same amount of weight, right? Each wrong answer is equally potentially convincing. Oftentimes, it's pretty easy for just about everybody to narrow down to the top 2 answers, but what makes things challenging is differentiating between the 2, right? So at this point, where you can add the absolute most value is by saying, yes, it's awesome that I'm narrowing down to two answer choices, but from there, what next step do I need to be taking? What critical step am I missing along the way that's causing incorrect answers to be convincing to me? And this is where learning the why behind commonly missed questions, not just the content areas, but why specifically you ran into trouble on that question can be so absolutely essential. And one of the key ways of ensuring that we're doing so is by reflecting in our practice. Now, I'm a big proponent of error logging. I know that a lot of my folks who utilize GMAT Club as a resource for practice questions will find that they're big proponents of error logging as well. So I'm sure error logging is a concept you guys feel comfortable with. If it's not, you're definitely missing out because GMAT Club has a built-in error logging system that allows you to look at the data behind the questions that you miss, the questions you get correct, the time you're investing on those questions. And that's a process that I suggest my students take up all the time as well. Now, a lot of students will steer away from error logging because it does take some time to complete. It does. But I find that it is the single biggest differentiator between students who make substantial score improvements and hit top tier scores versus those who don't. So you'll want to ensure along the way that when you go through practice questions, when you've narrowed down to 2 and chosen the wrong answer, or even oftentimes when you've chosen correctly, but you couldn't verbalize to somebody else, you couldn't teach to somebody else why you chose that correct answer, you'll want to ensure that you're taking a look at what about wrong answers you're finding convincing. Because very oftentimes, especially in verbal, very oftentimes, students will find themselves caught up in this endless cycle of looking at the data and seeing, all right, well, I'm missing more geometry questions, or I'm missing more critical reasoning assumption questions. And yes, they'll target in and they'll practice and they'll take a look at geometry questions, or they'll target and they'll practice and they'll take a look at assumption questions. But if the root of the issue wasn't in their content, wasn't in understanding the question structure and understanding the corresponding content, sometimes they're taking this kind of circuitous route around the path to the answer. So what we want to look to do is we want to ensure that we're differentiating strategy-driven opportunities from content-driven opportunities. There's an enormous difference between missing a geometry question because you didn't know properties of right triangles versus being perfectly comfortable with properties of right triangles, but not necessarily recognizing to draw that particular line and create that particular right triangle. Or perhaps, in general, you know what an assumption is, but you're consistently thrown off by answer options that seem to strengthen the argument, but don't have to be true in order for that argument to make sense. So you'll want to make sure that you're really digging that layer further into what about wrong answers you find convincing and what causes you to sway toward them. And a really great way to start to do that is a combination of really diligent reflection and error logging and targeting in your practice. So once you've gone through the content, perhaps you've taken a look at a course or you've gone through materials and you feel as though you've seen what there is to see in terms of content. Next steps from there oftentimes come from recognizing what your strategic opportunities for improvement look like. And you can do that by starting general in your practice, pinpointing or identifying strategic opportunities for improvement, and then addressing those strategic opportunities for improvement and cycling back through that process so that your score never has the potential to plateau. Now, as I mentioned, a really key element of that process is error logging. And I'm not necessarily expecting that you can see this on screen, so don't worry too much about that. But the point that I want to make here is you'll want to ensure in whatever capacity you keep track of your mistakes. I'm pretty preferential to an error log that is in some sort of an Excel, Google Sheets structured format that allows us to, one, minimize the time we invest putting down the clerical data, and two, allows us to aggregate the data without really investing any time, allows you to pick up on patterns and see, hey, when I invest additional time in a question, does it tend to pay off for me or doesn't it? What questions tend to sneak up on me and become time-consuming questions without me necessarily recognizing that I'm investing all this time in the question? And what were my strategic opportunities for improvement when moving through these questions? Because you may find, again, that you have content-driven room for improvement and you may need to seek back to learning materials concerning whatever that content area might be. But you may also find yourself in a position to where under timed conditions you make careless mistakes, to where you are persuaded by a very specific type of wrong answer in verbal. Maybe you get to the point to where you narrow down to two, but then you end up using your ear and selecting the wrong answer between the two because you've overlooked meaning as an error type. It's a really common construction that a lot of students fall under. So you'll want to make sure that you're identifying and addressing strategic opportunities along the way by recognizing where you're investing your time, where it's adding value, and by minimizing and eliminating low value add time. So with that in mind, I do want to make sure, and I have this structured to be kind of a shorter session for us, but it's because I want to make sure I have plenty of time toward the close for us to talk about bigger picture takeaways. So as you guys have questions, as you have elements of pacing, elements of this process that we have not yet addressed, please jump into the chat and let me know, and I'll make sure that we address them before I hop off screen. But again, the couple of things, just bigger picture suggestions to all concerning pacing and how to structure your practice process for improvement is developing a practice routine that is designed specifically to tackle plateaus, but plateaus in both content and approach. Again, if you're just continually cycling through and looking at the quantitative data-driven feedback that tells you I'm missing more XYZ question type, and you're missing the portion where you say, okay, what structures, what types of wrong answers, what processes do I find I run into the most trouble with? You're only tackling half the battle So you'll want to make sure that you're looking for strategic opportunities in both the content and the approach as you look to grab extra points and whittle away that gap between your current score and your goal. You'll also want to make sure that as you prepare, you work on creating structure you can control. The more that you put yourself in a position to where you are processing through what your path to the answer looks like, what first steps you might need to keep in mind along the way, and what step by step to look for and to look out for in each and every question you encounter, the easier it will be to translate that process out of how you perform in practice tests, out of how you perform in even low pressure, untimed environments, into how you perform on test day. So again, you'll want to ensure along the way that you're looking for those strategic opportunities for improvement by recognizing where you invest low value add time. And along the way, especially if you find that you have taken the test before and you underperformed as compared to your practice tests, well, that doesn't always necessarily mean that test day threw you notably different or more challenging questions. Oftentimes, students will find that under the pressure of time conditions, they'll abandon the practices that they've confidently moved through in their practice because they feel like the pressure's on, it's the real thing. I need to take whatever that path to the answer is, no matter what it looks like. But if we can create structure we can control, if we know what our first couple of steps going into each question look like, if we can recognize to say, hey, by the time I read through the remaining 2 answer choices a third time, I'm not really adding a ton of value anymore. Instead, I want to use that opportunity to eliminate one of those 2 answers, select the other one, and just move forward from here. Whether it's by utilizing a couple of statistics-driven trends or by recognizing on a case-by-case basis answer choices that are unlikely to be viable, even if you just need to move a little quicker through that question. And I get it. I know it sounds super cheesy, but you'll want to ensure that you're emphasizing quality over quantity as you move through your practice. It's really easy, and I see students make this mistake all the time. It's really easy to get to the point where post-content review, when you're digging in and you're trying to make improvements, you see your score plateau despite investing a bunch of time rolling through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of questions. Instead, you'll want to ensure that you are learning absolutely everything that you can about the questions you encounter so you can see the next time around what that path to the answer should look like. So perhaps on that question, rather than just going through the explanation and going, all right, well, this makes sense now that it's been explained to me. See if you can pinpoint specifically where you failed to move forward in that question or where you went a different direction on that question, because that's the strategic opportunity for improvement you'll want to be targeting. Again, regardless of whether it deals with the big picture content area or a faltering step that you took in your approach. So the more you can emphasize quality over quantity, the better served you're going to be to ensure all of the practice that you're putting this time into is adding really active value. Now, beyond that, I want to circle back to a point that I touched on a little bit earlier on, but that I want to make sure we're feeling comfortable with. And it is that when it comes to pacing and when it comes to improving on the speed, just the flat out speed at which you move through questions, improved speed in quant tends to come from building on your number sense, on your fluency, not by rushing too quickly through the analysis. I see a lot of students who are, in many cases, very strong in their quantitative skills, very strong in their understanding of mathematics, who struggle when it comes to very specific subsets of GMAT questions because they run into this issue of being too quick to want to put pen to paper and crunch the numbers or set up the algebra, when a conceptual approach may have made a little more sense. So we want to make sure we recognize we save time when we build on number sense and when we build on fluency. We don't save time by trying to rush too quickly through the analysis or by getting to an answer that matches something in our answer choices, selecting it and moving on. Because one of the biggest mistakes students will make, especially in problem-solving quantitative questions, is that they'll stop a step short and they'll answer the wrong question. They'll answer a different question than the one that was being asked. They'll answer for the alternate variable in a system of equations, or perhaps they'll apply the percent to a wrong base in a percent question. So we want to make sure that we're taking the time on the front end and taking the time on the close of the question to structure the question the most efficient way possible, and answer the question that's being asked. And we build on time by building on that in-between space. Now with verbal, I know a lot of you guys had a little more concern when it came to the verbal pacing. A couple of folks saying, I run out of time on the last 2, 3, 4 questions, or I know that I sink a lot of time into a reading comprehension passage and then I feel rushed moving through other question types along the way. We want to note that improved speed in verbal tends to come from identifying and eliminating low value add processes and that kind of deliberation that we take between 2 or 3 remaining answer choices where we sit back and forth and don't make a ton of progress because we're focusing on the wrong elements. Again, when we look to use process of elimination as a tool in verbal, we do so by finding something wrong with all but one answer and by default selecting the remaining answer, not by finding the merit or what we like or how we would have worded it the same way out of potentially incorrect answers. Because as soon as an answer choice, even if it's 99% correct, as soon as an answer choice is 1% wrong, it's a wrong answer. So we want to make sure we're looking for those strategic opportunities to save on low value add processes. Because again, you can afford to miss questions and still do exceptionally well on this test. You can't afford to be stubborn and misapply your time and still expect to maximize your success on the test. So I ran through a couple of bigger picture concepts that I'm hoping you guys will be able to keep in mind and think through as you move through your practice. Does anyone have any questions for me on anything around the big picture that they'd like to take a moment to talk about? Again, content-driven stuff, that's awesome. I'll make a note of it and we'll look to potentially incorporate future sessions that deal with strategies around sentence correction, strategies around reading comprehension when it comes to the content. When it comes to strategically thinking about pacing our way through the test, we improve on that pacing by going into attack mode, right? Using process of elimination to find something definitively wrong out of wrong answers, and by looking to read at the right level. So, is it okay to skip a reading comprehension? I really don't recommend it, Yash. And I will say, I know that it's a commonly applied strategy. I know that it's one that students have said, hey, I got to my goal score applying this because it allowed me to spend time elsewhere. So when you skip a reading comprehension, and in many cases, students will skip a reading comprehension and say, okay, the second one I see or the third one I see, I'm just gonna skip it flat out, right? I don't suggest it because there's a very good chance along the way that you are missing high potential value add questions. So by that I mean, is it okay to put yourself in a position to where if you've checked in on your time position and you know that you are well behind where you should be in pacing and you need to make up some serious time, finding an RC passage to where perhaps you do a little more of a surface level, high overview read through, right? A little bit of a quicker process, and you attempt to tackle just the big picture questions that deal with specific concepts that you can get based on that initial read through, but perhaps you make an educated guess on detail-driven questions that would task you to route back and spend a lot of time word searching or finding that relevant corresponding detail. I do think that there are some guessing strategies wherein if you get to the point where on test day you are more than 5 or so minutes behind on your pacing and you know you need to strategically make that time up somewhere, I think that there are opportunities to spend very little time on an RC passage while still upping our probability for success. But planning on test day to just take those corresponding 3 or 4 questions as a loss and move forward can pretty detrimentally impact your score. So I would encourage you, even if you're in a position to where you need to move more quickly through that process, I would encourage you to use your error logging, use your reflecting to identify low value add processes wherever they exist. Because it might not be that you just hit one reading comp passage that takes you for a whirl and it wouldn't have been worth the time invested anyways. You may find that you can afford to spend a little more time reading through a reading comp passage or analyzing the corresponding questions if you know that there's a process in sentence correction that you take every single time you encounter a sentence correction question that just flat out doesn't add value, right? So we want to look for strategic opportunities to eliminate low value add processes. And I generally don't think that the best opportunity, the most ideal opportunity, even if you know that pacing isn't always your friend in verbal, is by skipping an entire passage. So how to know when you should move ahead with pacing. If it takes a long time, but the accuracy is good, but when the pace, so I see what you're getting at there. Let's take a moment to talk through this. So if you're in a position to where you know you continually fall behind in pacing, one of the biggest steps that I would take, especially if you don't have your test coming up in the next week or the next 2 weeks, if you have some time on your hands, what I would suggest doing is I would suggest stepping into test conditions in your practice. So basically taking a set of practice questions that are just low pressure, you're taking the time that you need to inventory the relevant information and to address those questions, but you're keeping track of the pacing, right? So again, don't cut yourself off on time, but keep track of the pacing. Make sure that it's true to what you want to see on test day. Keep track of the pacing and then reflect to see, where am I investing time that is low value add? Where am I investing too much time on questions? Because you'll be in a better position to start by building the foundations, building your comfort and building your confidence with questions, and then whittling away at processes that you've identified as low value add, then setting yourself a 2-minute timer for absolutely every question and stopping yourself when you've hit that point. Now, there is a point to be made at the fact that at some point we do need to write that discrepancy between the time you're taking and the time you'll have on test day. So the way that we do that is by moving from low pressure, untimed conditions into timed conditions, but without that kind of looming practice test score over your head, so that you can see what sorts of adjustments you might make when you hit a pacing benchmark and you realize that you're 6, 7, 8 minutes behind on time. What adjustment you might make along the way. Into your practice test environment, where now we need to think about strategically where we invest the time, but we're going to use the data from the earlier steps in the process to say, okay, what time am I investing that consistently isn't adding value? Right? If I hit this particular question type and I'm feeling lost on first glance, or I fail to identify the conclusion of the argument in a CR question, right? This may be a process to where rather than investing 2.5 minutes and then making an educated guess, I want to hit that 30-second mark and say, okay, if I'm looking to my answer choices, is there anything that guides me towards something that would be a more realistic answer? Is there anything here that is obviously incorrect because it mimics a structure that we commonly see as a trap answer type? Select from among the remaining choices and move on. So it's building from kind of this low pressure environment where you're able to build on your confidence and build on your approach into structures that become a little more high pressure, but wherein you've built enough structure around the process that you're able to continue to be successful. So if I'm on a lengthy 700 plus difficulty question and I get in a dilemma, whether to leave it as is or it would take more than 5 minutes to solve. So Priya, more than 5 minutes. If you see a 700 plus, even if it's a 700 plus level question, if you see a question to where the path you've developed in the back of your head to take to the answer is one that you know will take you 5+ minutes to move through, it is almost certainly not the path that the author of that question has intended for you. Again, even on high-level questions, and I will say, high-level questions aren't inherently always more time-consuming questions either, right? Like high-level questions may have been more challenging because of the abstraction. They may have been more challenging because they made it tougher for you to see what that question was asking us to do. Or in verbal, they may have been more challenging because they made wrong answers just a little more convincing. So if you're in a position to where you know that that path to the answer would take you 5+ minutes to solve, I think that you've identified an inefficient approach that may not yield the level of results you intend right off the bat anyhow. So I would again take that step back. That was that second situation in the decision point of how to move forward on questions that I mentioned. If you know that the path you're going to take to the answer is an inefficient one that is more time consuming than you could afford, take a step back. Look for secondary strategies, see if there's anything you've missed in the question stem, missed in the process, and look to eliminate obviously wrong answers to see where to go from there. And I would say that in general, even if you're a little ahead on time, but particularly if you're at or behind time, if you know that it is above, if it's a 3-minute question to solve, if it's gonna take you a little over the 2-minute mark, well, fine. But keep in mind that that means that you'll need to ensure that you've got questions along the way that are conceptual questions you can move through in a minute, or you might be able to move through in 45 seconds. Again, not all questions are designed to take precisely the same amount of time. Some questions are structured to where the challenge in that question was saying, hey, I'm gonna throw 2 or 3 more steps your way, and I wanna see if you have the confidence to move through those additional 2 or 3 steps, even though you know it might take you a little over that 2-minute mark. I will say very consistently, students who stop themselves at precisely 2 minutes per question or precisely 1.8 in verbal consistently do not maximize their score potential. We want to think about applying our time as effectively as we can across the section as a whole. So ESR shows get stuck at a score of the low 30s every time I get the initial questions in verbal wrong, no matter how well I do on the remaining ones. Ooh, so this is a really great point that I want to speak to. It is, to an extent, kind of a myth that the first questions are abundantly more important, right? The algorithm, the item response theory that builds the difficulty level of questions you encounter, right? The scoring algorithm does not take into account where you saw the question or how much time you spent on that question. The scoring algorithm, again, 2 elements at play, is just looking at the difficulty level of the question by keeping in mind, again, the percent of students who get the question correct, but also the B value, right? The likelihood that high-level students get the question correct and low-level students get the question incorrect. It's taking into account the potential that you could guess the question correctly, right? Because even though we have 5 answer choices across the board, that's not always precisely the same. Sometimes we hit questions where we can very clearly narrow down to 2 answers, and then the challenge is, where do we go from there, right? And the GMAT takes that into account, as well as trying to ensure that you are taking the time to address questions across different content, right? So there's a mechanism at play in there as well. So if you're in a position to where you know that investing a bit of extra time on the front end tends to add value for you, that's fine. If you hit question 10 and you're about 5 minutes behind in total, that's probably okay. And perhaps even a little more wiggle room than that in verbal, because we don't necessarily know how that breakdown looks in terms of, all right, well, how much reading comp did you get up front versus sentence correction? So when we talk about benchmarking for verbal, you're gonna want to give yourself a little more leeway around that benchmarked time, depending on what question structures you've seen in the first place. So I'm interested to know, and Adrian, you're welcome to ping me in GMAT Club and let me know. I'd be happy to take a look at that enhanced score report, or the enhanced score reports if there are plural of them, and let you know my thoughts. Generally, there's a lot more than meets the eye with those reports if we know what to look for, especially when it comes to kind of the strategy and the big picture. So feel free to ping me and let's talk a little bit about that. Because if you're missing like a very large handful of those questions early on, well then yes, it can be a little more challenging to recover from consistently telling the algorithm that you can't handle above medium level questions. But I'd be interested in digging a little more into what that has to say. Again, my big picture takeaway for everyone on that note, because it's a really, really great point, is if you find that you are 3, 4, 5 minutes behind in total after question 5, after question 10, particularly if you are not a top 1% score seeker, you're probably in all right shape. But make sure along the way that you're looking for the potential to whittle away low value add processes, because just because a question's the first question, the second question, the third question you're encountering doesn't inherently mean we necessarily want to be spending abundantly more time on that question. So I want to make sure that I've got, is it an approach to guessing some of the questions in the middle of verbal in order to save time for the last couple of questions? Will it improve the score? So this is interesting because statistically speaking, I know a lot of experts have gone out there and made suggestions around like, hey, I purposely missed the first 10 questions and the middle 10 questions and the last 10 questions, and here's how my score output looked. Essentially, purposely guessing at random almost never allows you to maximize your potential. Now, if you know you've practiced, you've whittled away processes, you need to find strategic opportunities to save some time, and you know consistently that you are still several minutes behind in pacing every time you practice test, well, then finding strategic opportunities to guess low potential questions early on absolutely are a process that we could take. So if you're in a position where maybe you invest 10 or 15 seconds in the question and you say, okay, I don't see what the path to the answer would look like. I'm having difficulty breaking down this CR argument. Or in the context of RC, I know I'd have to filter back through a lot of information I didn't get a good read on initially to be able to move forward. By all means, making an educated guess is a really powerful strategy there. So maybe taking the opportunity to say, all right, I've got 2 or 3 questions where I'm gonna punt really early on in the question because I've identified it as a low value add question. By all means, definitely feel free to do so. But I wouldn't do it with a handful of questions in a row at random. So hopefully that answers your question. So face difficulties in 700 level questions in verbal sections, specifically CR and official guide. Didn't clear the type of meaning. If you're in that situation, what do we do? So in your practice, what we want to look to do is we want to look to identify what's problematic for you about that structure by, again, building from low pressure untimed conditions, working on identifying cues and indicators that let us know the components of elements in an argument. We've got a bunch of videos put together on this note that you're welcome to check out. A lot of resources available on GMAT Club, elsewhere, to be able to take a look. But what you'll want to do is you'll want to work on building the foundations of how you go about breaking down components in an argument and identifying the kind of gap in reasoning in an assumption, strengthen, weaken, evaluate question by identifying what must be true in an inference question. Basically, the more you can build structure into the process, the better served you're going to be, even as questions become more challenging. Because one big thing that I want to point out is that on high-level questions, whether it's quant or verbal, on high-level questions, you don't see a drastic jump or shift in the content that you're being tested on. You're not seeing abundantly new and different content on higher level questions. What happens is that our content becomes a little more obscured. It becomes a little tougher to break down, and especially in the context of verbal, wrong answers become a little more convincing. Right? So yeah, we want to look for the potential here to, again, identify what that process should look like for you. Build a process that is effective for you on low-level questions, effective for you on medium-level questions, and then see how to translate that process and where the gap exists when you move into higher-level questions. And the best way that you can do that is by reflecting on your practice and seeing specifically where you run into trouble on questions that you are not able to correctly identify the argument, or on questions where you're not able to consistently route to the correct answer. So have enough time at the end of my quant and verbal sections, but I get the medium level questions wrong, and then when I go over the correct answers, I know them. Oh, this is such a common occurrence, Fido, that I want to take a moment to talk about. So in the context of, hey, I have enough time, and this is huge because pacing isn't just a method to make sure we don't run out of time. This is a huge misconception that, like, we don't need pacing strategies as long as we don't run out of time. That is absolutely false. Pacing is not about just making sure we get through the section. It's about making sure that we're applying our time as effectively as we possibly can. And so part of that, if you know you get medium level questions wrong, but when you go over the correct answers, it seems obvious or it seems clear to you, there's something about the timed nature or the conditions that isn't connecting. Now, I will say, as a quick aside, this is a process that comes to most GMAT test takers early on as kind of a frustratingly frequent occurrence, because oftentimes the challenging questions isn't supposed to be that the math is abundantly challenging, or it isn't supposed to be that the vocabulary is above and beyond. The challenge is supposed to be recognizing what that path to the answer looks like. So Fido, what I would suggest is taking a little bit of time to move through, whether it's untimed questions or timed questions wherein it's not a practice test, you're not concerned with where the score falls, but taking some time to intentionally invest a little more time than you think you need on the analysis of the question to see how that pays off in the rest of the process that you take through. Because I think you'd be pleasantly surprised to find that when you take enough time on the front end of the question, when you aren't subconsciously rushing yourself through the front end of the question, that path to the answer that seemed so obvious to you in review will be more likely to come to you, will be more likely to be recognized because you are investing the time in the right space, not just across the section, but also across the question. So with that in mind, hopefully that answers your question. Definitely feel free to follow up if you have anything else on that note. Ooh, so this is a good note to land on. And again, I'll hang out in the chat and answer any questions. Any of you guys who are seeing this video but not tuning in live, feel free to ask any relevant questions in the comments. I tend to circle back to these videos and try to answer any of those questions that you might happen to have, or feel free to ping me on GMAT Club. My GMAT Club handle is Veritas Prep Hailey. So just Veritas Prep, Hailey. All right. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Thank you guys who are taking a look even post-session. Again, feel free to leave any lingering questions just in the comments, and I'd be happy to circle back and take a look. And otherwise, happy studying, everyone.